my name is Steve Hayes from the University of Nevada, Reno, and I'm here to facilitate a discussion with two of my good friends and colleagues who are contributors to the upcoming book on evolution science and contextual behavioral science, a reintegration. And so I'd like to welcome my guests, David Sloan Wilson, who's president of Evolution Institute and professor at Binghamton University, and Paul Atkins, who's at the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education at Australian Catholic University. And I believe the current president of the Australian and New Zealand chapter of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. I think it should be shared with the group that all three of us have been working together for some time on this project we're calling Pro-Social. And that will undoubtedly be a focus of our discussion, although not exclusively. And so the focus here is on small groups and looking at it from evolution science and contextual behavioral science point of view. I've asked both of my colleagues here to just hold forth for 5 or 6 minutes on what they wrote about in their chapter, and then we'll begin a discussion. So David, if there's no reason to otherwise, why don't we start with you?
Sure, great. So the title of my chapter is called Small Groups as Fundamental Units of Social Organization. And the first point I make about that is that the whole concept of this small groups is something that's obscured from some intellectual perspectives and enlightened from an evolutionary perspective. So the perspectives of reductionism and methodological individualism all seem to make higher level units go away. Why should small groups be fundamental when they can be decomposed into individuals, and individuals can be decomposed into still smaller units? But in evolution, of course, is multi-level. Biological units exist from the molecular level all the way up to ecosystems. But in evolution, there's a privileged level of analysis, which is the unit of selection. This is what becomes the functionally organized unit. Everything lower than that becomes organ-like, and everything above that becomes population-like and ecosystem-like. And so we have this privileging of a level of analysis, which can be the individual but need not be the individual, because when groups are the unit of selection, then it's the group that becomes the organism, and the individual achieves a kind of an organ-like status. So this is a profound difference from reductionistic approaches, which takes everything down to the lower level. It's actually a form of holism, which is very scientifically legitimate. So it's against that background that we can begin to think of human social groups as units of selection, and therefore a fundamental unit of human social organization. So that's how I begin my chapter. And the concept of a major evolutionary transition comes in. This is what happens when selection within groups becomes suppressed to the point that the group becomes, between group selection becomes the dominating evolutionary force. So we can think of small human groups as organisms of sorts. People hold each other accountable for their actions. It's a form of guarded egalitarian, and it's against that background that we can begin to think about small groups in modern life. So here's where Eleanor Ostrom comes in, somebody that's been very familiar to all of us. She's a political scientist by training, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009 for showing that groups are capable of managing their common pool resources contrary to conventional wisdom, but only if certain conditions are met. And Ostrom won the prize for showing that there's 8 core design principles for regulating these common pool resource groups. So let me list them very quickly, and then I'm going to pass it on to Paul here very quickly. So what she found empirically is that groups that have a strong identity and purpose work well. They know who they are, what their resource is. There's a fair distribution of costs and benefits. It's not the case that some individuals get all the benefits while others do all the work. There's fair and inclusive decision making. It's not the case that some people get left out of the decision making process. There's monitoring of agreed upon behavior. There's graduated sanctions for misbehavior. There's fast and fair conflict resolution. There's authority to self-govern. And there's also appropriate relations among other groups in a multi-group population. And when you look at these from an evolutionary perspective, what you see is that these are the very conditions that accomplish a major transition. But, basically, in groups where the design principles are strongly in place, then it's very difficult for someone to benefit themselves at the expense of other members of the same group. So this has become a practical framework for the efficacy of groups that we've incorporated into pro-social as one piece of pro-social, but then there's another piece that comes from CBS. So I like to think that what we're doing with pro-social is the kind of unification that we're seeking to achieve with our volume.
Paul, you want to pick up?
Yeah, it's actually a great point to transition. So in my chapter, I was trying to make three main points. The first point was very much about the learning processes that affect groups. And the most modern groups are affected primarily by symbolic learning. So the agreements that we've come to, the policies, the rules, the understandings that we have of what we're trying to achieve and so forth. But I wanted to just slip this point in based on a lot of experience working with groups, that groups are also affected by earlier, more primitive forms of learning. So more stimulus-driven learning, respondent learning and operant conditioning and so forth. You know, just to give a practical example of that, I've often worked with groups where one person might be particularly disruptive, and you just wonder whether you know, they seem to be reactive to everything, for example, when you think about the early attachment patterns they might have formed and you know, these very sort of basic emotional learning processes can affect groups as well. So I just wanted to broaden out the notion from the idea that small groups are purely affected by rational, linguistic, sort of verbal processes. That was my first point. Probably the main part of the book, of the chapter, though, was much more focused on two particular capabilities, psychological capabilities, if you like, perspective-taking ability and psychological flexibility. So perspective-taking ability, obviously the capacity to step into the shoes of another, to understand their position, and that seems to me to be absolutely fundamental and critical to really high-performing groups, that people can understand where others are coming from and that they can thereby coordinate their activities. But the point I was trying to make, and coming from a contextual perspective, was oftentimes perspective-taking ability is conceptualised as some kind of trait that people have or they don't have. Of course, it's developmental, it's a learned ability, but it's also highly contextual. I've done a lot of work working with groups in mediation, for example, or teaching them conflict resolution skills. And oftentimes you get enormous perspective-taking arising just from telling people to repeat back what the other person said as best they can. So perspective-taking, like all behaviour, is situated in a context. And, you know, it can come from the history, the personal history of the person, but it can also come from the context that we create. And, you know, we'll come back to this, no doubt, but this is part of the hope of pro-social, is can we create alternate contexts that create better cooperation and coordination. The other piece that seems to me to be really important is psychological flexibility, the capacity to move in the direction of what matters to us individually or as a group, even in the presence of difficult or aversive experiences. And obviously that's absolutely key as well, because oftentimes we have differences and conflicts and so forth, and we need to be able to manage and move ahead effectively even in that presence of that. I wanted to sort of say that I think I see psychological flexibility, and instead of sort of a lot of people see it in terms of resilience, which seems to me to be like pushing through difficulty in some way. But psychological flexibility, if you look at the contextual behavioural science literature, is conceptualised, in my view, more as sort of seeing through rather than pushing through. It's more just noticing the way in which our verbally constructed world can be trapping us and creating rigidity. And then the third part, and I'll finish up with this, was just, we'll possibly explore this in more detail later, was the ways in which psychological flexibility and perspective taking transform Ostrom's principles that David was mentioning. You can imagine, take for example, identity. The first principle, we talk about a strong sense of shared identity and purpose. Identity is very much a double-edged sword. It's the basis of exclusion and stereotyping and prejudice and so forth if it's held rigidly. If it's held lightly, it can be the basis of belonging and a sense of community and so forth, provided that we're looking at, you know, how well is our constructing of a verbal constructing of the world, how well is it serving us? So, and that's true for all the other principles. Equity is obviously transformed if we can step into the shoes of another and see what they care about. Monitoring and graded sanctions and conflict resolution, they're all transformed by our capacity to hold our own sort of rightness lightly and be able to understand the point of view of another and to hold all of that in the context of functionalism of, you know, how well is this working for our shared aims? That's probably as much as I need to say at this point.
Well, I think we've bracketed a kind of fascinating set of issues that have to do with this specific issue, but also the whole larger purpose of the volume as we sort of deal with these levels of analysis and bringing these two fields together. But perhaps before doing that, let's see if we can bring the listeners in just on what is meant by pro-social, since we moved past that fairly quickly. Perhaps somebody could describe pro-social as a project and a little bit about how it's been assembled so that when we're speaking of it that way and not just the common sense use of the term, that people will understand what's being talked about even before they've read the volume.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Steve. So pro-social is a practical framework for improving the efficacy of real-world groups and at the same time serving as a scientific database for the continuing study of groups. So I regard this as a grand experiment in social engineering, you might say, in a benign sense. So very simply, we work with real groups, and there's a first section which is based on psychological flexibility. Then there's a second section based on teaching the core design principles, and a third section for formulating short-term goals so that the group can hit the ground running after going through the process. This is a process that can take place in a couple of days in a retreat-like setting, or in 3 meetings with a little homework between meetings in a workplace setting. So, and we think that this can be used by groups around the world, and we have quite a bit of experience under our belt now of this being actually a great change method for groups.
Do you want to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, I guess just to say that, as David said, we are using it in contexts that range from community development through private corporations, public sector agencies. We're using it in a large group of trainers that exist, you know, virtually online, as it were. Well, the trainers themselves are obviously real, but their communication in their group is virtual and online. So we're trying out lots of different contexts. I suppose I'd add, I think that first part is about building psychological flexibility and perspective taking ability. Maybe they're very closely related to one another, but they're very much. When I talk to people about pro-social, I talk about the need to develop a sense of self-awareness and a sense of perspective taking, psychological flexibility, but self-awareness also of what we care about, what our values are, what our goals are, and then relate that to the larger group. So, as I'm sure we'll go into in more detail, I mean, one of the big learnings for me out of this project, and David's written about this very clearly, is the way in which what we're really about is managing the relationship between group interests and individual interests and the interests of the broader system. So we're sort of managing those 3 sets of relationships. And I think that the way that we introduce psychological flexibility and perspective taking, it puts the individual in the picture in a very real way that allows us to then have that conversation about the relationship between self-interest and group interest in a more sort of profound and real way than we would if there was a whole lot of, I think oftentimes in groups there's a sort of undiscussable nature of self-interest. It's like you're not allowed to have self-interest in many groups. But it should be out there and on the table because it's actually the basis of all the stuff that often gets in the way of groups.
Yeah, of course, that depends. And so much depends on the theoretical background. This is another form of contextualism. If you're an economist and if you're in many business groups, then it's all about self-interest. That's the only thing you ever appeal to. And yet in a church group or in some other kind of groups, then self-interest becomes the elephant in the room. But one of the ways I describe the first piece, or the first two pieces of pro-social, is that the second piece, the design principles, provides a kind of a functional blueprint. This is what a group wants to become. But the first piece, but that requires change for groups that are not already working perfectly. And that requires change. Change is difficult. It's difficult for individuals, can be even more difficult for groups. And so that's the first part that increases the capacity for change. And one thing I would love is for both of you, because I know we've had this conversation a lot, it's probably going to appear in some of the other chapters, have started to think about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, as an evolutionary process at the individual level. Change is evolution, and when individuals change by a therapeutic process, they're actually evolving, and we can get some added value from thinking about individual change and group change as an evolutionary process. So I invite both of you to just share your thoughts that we've been having in our many conversations.
Maybe I'll jump in a little bit. Let's see if Paul is willing to take that on. What do you think?
Well, where to start? I'll let you start off, Steve. I'll be interested to hear your point of view.
Well, I mean, just in general, I think all forms of change can be thought of from an evolutionary point of view, and psychotherapy and behavior change, has to do with variation, selective retention in context at the right dimension and level. So it's best thought of that way. I think psychopathology can be thought of that way, and I do think kind of preparing individuals for change is a matter of creating enough flexibility so that there is some variation from which to select, and enough attention to context so that you can do it wisely, and then enough focus on what the selection criteria are so that as you build new patterns, you're building ones that you really want. But do it also, the fascinating thing about this question right now is at the right level. And David, of course, you're noted for the work on multi-level selection. I imagine a number of readers coming in and just hearing about contextual behavioral science, evolution science would be thinking, well, this has something to do with psychology and the rest of the behavioral sciences and biology. And the view would be the biological unit is the small unit and the psychological unit is the bigger unit. And then here suddenly we're in one where it's kind of cattywampus, and the individual is seen in the context only of a larger group, but viewed from the point of view of evolution science. So it's fascinating, and I just wanted to mark it, you did in both of your comments, that as we get into the details about pro-social, we actually have to and ask the readers to have enough flexibility to think about these units at different levels, and to not immediately be assuming that when you're talking about evolution science, you're talking about, for example, only the genetic level.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. We've got to fight that a little bit, because I think that actually is in the room.
Yeah, so that piece about multi-level is obviously absolutely crucial, the notion of groups all the way down and up, and it's actually does transform our understanding of what even an individual is.
Well, I mean, we've been bandying around the idea of the individual as a group, but let's
exactly
put that on the table. In what sense is an individual a group?
Well, and so maybe this would be a way to enter back into design principles, because the design principles, of course, were originally developed for common pool resources, and the Nobel was won for that, not for a change method to change groups. And here in the process of working together, we've felt the necessity, and David, you just pointed to it, of figuring out a way to create greater openness to change, even to be able to apply the design principle. Would it be worth just giving a little bit of thought to that issue of to what degree do the design principles port over directly to the issue of pro-sociality, and as if you're trying to actually foster groups that are successful in that way, and what else had to be brought in and why?
Well, so you're right that Ostrom studied a certain kind of group, and these are groups that attempt to manage common pool resources. And my collaboration with her, one of the things it served to do was to generalize to other kinds of groups. And it's curious actually that was not has not really been done otherwise. It's still the case that her work is studied mostly in the context of common pool resource groups, and we generalize it in two ways. One is to show that the design principles follow very generally from multi-level selection theory, from the evolutionary dynamics of cooperation in all species, and our own history as a highly cooperative species. And then once you take that on, then it becomes clear that really these design principles should apply to all groups. And one way to think about that is that cooperation is itself a common pool resource. Any group requiring members to work together for some kind of common goal are going to have the same problems as a common pool resource group and will require the same solutions. I should add right away that the core design principles are necessary but not sufficient. They're not the only principles you need. Anyone who's been in a group knows, especially a business group, for example, knows all the many rules that are required in order to do whatever any given group needs to do. But these principles are called core because they're so essential for cooperation. So it's an empirical question, a hypothesis that the core design principle should be applied to different kinds of groups. And that's one of the things that we're testing. We've tested it for intentional communities. We're testing it for business groups. And so far, I think the results have been very confirmatory, and in some cases counterintuitive, because as we touched upon earlier, the zeitgeist in business groups is often one of complete selfishness, social Darwinism. We expect that everyone's motivated by self-interest, that competition within groups is a good thing. The whole model of leadership is often very top-down. So against some backgrounds, the core design principles as a blueprint for a well-functioning group are highly counterintuitive. Really, counseled against by the worldview, by the prevailing worldview.
Can I pick up on that point? I've increasingly started to appreciate the language of the commons, and whilst it's definitely true what David was saying, that most of the applications of Ostrom's work has been in the area of common pool resources, there's this burgeoning notion of commoning, if you like, or the commons, which is obviously applicable in many, many, many situations. Any situation where we share a resource, so it might be songs or genes or a shared database of scientific papers or an actual physical resource of some sort. So I see this behaviour, what we're actually, I suppose, prescribing in a way, I have seen it as being increasingly prescriptive, is an alternative to this dominant worldview that some people have called Homo economicus, if you like, of individuals that are competing with one another to maximise their utility. Ostrom was really, as I read Ostrom, she was really arguing against alternate ways of organising, which are the market or the state, top-down regulation or competitive market forces between individuals. And I think she was pointing to this third way, which is the possibility of creating shared agreements that allow us to coordinate activity without having to rely upon bare naked competition or top-down sort of rule governance, if you like. So, and to get back to your question, why is that about pro-social behaviour? I think that, David Bollier talks about the idea of enclosures in commons, that the market tends to enclose things, to occupy, to steal, basically, to take over common property, whether it's genes or whether it's land or whatever. That's an incredibly hostile act, isn't it, to occupy or take over and to make private ownership, this is mine, and other people can't have it, to create that sense of scarcity, which is what markets do. When we start talking about commoning, sharing resources for the good of all, then that's an inherently sort of pro-social act. And the thing where I think contextual behavioural science really adds something here is in the power of the stories that we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves that we're self-interested economic beings, that are just about maximising this one little thing, price or value, that's our only value is price or then that's what we'll become. But if we tell ourselves that there's this possibility of cooperation, David's, the point that David's made about that the unit of analysis should be small groups, not individuals. Well, that's both a descriptive claim, I think, that it would be more helpful for us as scientists to look at the group level selection, but it's also got a deep sort of prescriptive normative aspect to it as well, which is about these stories. If we look at small groups as the unit of analysis, then that might actually be more helpful for us as a way of organising society. So for me, there's a deep link between Ostrom's work and pro-sociality.
Well, let me riff off of that. I think that you're right that this paradigm that includes Ostrom plus more is a third way between total laissez-faire on one hand and command and control on the other hand. It's called polycentric governance because you have to address the larger scales in addition to the smaller scales. And you're right that the narratives that we tell each other are, in many ways, can be self-fulfilling prophecies, and yet at the same time, the narrative themselves is not good enough. And so, for example, if we told each other stories about let's all be cooperative, then that by itself would not work. That's why the design principles are so important, basically. And those design principles are, they've got teeth. I mean, it's like altruism with attitude, basically. There's rules there that really dictate what you can and cannot do. And although and they have their own form of selfishness. Design principle 1 defines the group who's in it, and if you're not in it, then you don't get to share the common pool resource. Really, altruism within a group turns into a kind of a group selfishness. And so pro-sociality requires not just figuring out what's pro-social within the group, but also how does a group fit into a larger multi-group social organization that in turn is pro-social. So, and this is where the engineering comes in. It's represented in the 8th design principle that relations among groups must reflect the same principles as the relationships among individuals within groups. The design principles are scale independent. So we need to tell the right story, and at the same time, we need to have the right mechanisms that are provided by the core design principle.
this might be kind of a geeky question, but it is one that interests me, and so forgive me for directing it towards it. But this idea that units of selection are privileged, and then if I take that and look at what you just said, David, at each level, of course, selection at the level of a group doesn't eliminate selection at lower levels. They're in a balance. But at each level, you can't understand the higher level without understanding the ones that are still higher, the nestedness, and lower. So, for example, cultural practices may be selected at a very high level on the one hand. If you start thinking selectively all the way down to the individual behaviors may be selected within the lifetime of the individual. There's features of the organism, like how much sleep you get, or what you eat, or what's going on in your gut, and so forth. Which all of these. So I wonder if one of the things that we're learning just in this process of forming this is this kind of dynamic, multi-level and multi-dimensional systemic kind of view in which at each level, we can't just stay at that level in order to understand it. And I do see that in the Ostrom principles. It's, especially if you're then willing to take the Ostrom principles and add in, well, what do you do about the individual? But then add in what again, what do you do about the selfishness aspects of the individual, like their prideful attempt to always be right, even at their own personal cost, might cost the group, might cost them individuals, might cost their relationships with their spouse. Does that change your view, David, about this unit of selection being privileged, or is it that only when you're focused on a certain level it's privileged, but that in order to understand it you then have to shift context to look at different levels, the different kind of resolutions at the same time?
Well, to apply it to something like sustainability, and the goal that all of us have basically for a sustainable Earth, in more general terms, that if you want some unit to be adaptive, to be sustainable, to be functional, then the selection has to be at the level of that unit. There's the privileging right there. And this is like profoundly against the invisible hand. The invisible hand pretends that the maximization of lower level self-interest robustly benefits the common good. That is profoundly not the case. At the same time, and I think I'm getting geeky here myself, that there's no shame in this group, right? But the mechanisms that evolve. Here we're bringing in the distinction between proximate and ultimate causation, or Tinbergen's 4 questions, an elaboration of proximate and ultimate function, mechanism, development, history. And I hope that in this book as a whole, that these will become thoroughly familiar concepts. Then you can have a group that's been selected at the group level, functions well as a group, but when you delve into the mechanisms, you find that actually does not require the members to have the welfare of the group in mind. So there, the invisible hand actually comes back in a legitimate form. And just to give a very simple example, reputation is huge in human groups. One reason that people behave for the good of their groups is that they're passionate about their reputations. If they misbehave, their reputations will tank, and then they'll do poorly as an individual. That's a pretty self-interested motive. And yet at the same time, it's a powerful mechanism for the group to work well. So a group can work well as a group without its members having the welfare of the group in mind, at least mechanistically.
Can I perhaps speak up on that? What the conversation that we're having right now is actually a really important conversation. We tend to partition it off as being geeky or theoretical or something, but in the end, this is part of our narrative, the narrative that we're telling. And I think it's really important that we become more skilled at talking about the selection forces at multiple levels at the same time, and you both alluded to that. So the narrative is not, let's all be more cooperative. Obviously, that's unhelpful. The narrative is, how can we understand the needs and the selection pressures on multiple levels at the same time, individuals, small groups, large groups. I mean, to put it in sort of more colloquial language, Adam Kahane, in his work on helping groups to function more effectively, and his work on scenario planning, talks about the distinction between love and power. When we privilege the larger organisation, the larger group, we're sort of privileging relationship and love and connection. When we privilege the individual, we're tending to privilege, you know, individual power or capacity to achieve one's own ends. We should be much more sophisticated at having that conversation that incorporates both love and connection and also power, I think. And I think that's the narrative we're trying to create in the work that we're doing together.
Well, what's happening is that we need to function both in the capacity as members of groups and also in the capacity as selective agents. So basically the ultimate causation, selecting groups to function well as groups, that's something that's done on the basis of policy or intentional planning or mindfulness-based reflection. We're trying to think, what kind of group do we want it to be? In that case, we're operating in ultimate causation mode. It's in that sense that unless we think on behalf of the whole group, then the group is not going to function well. What we decide to do is something that can fall back upon such things as individual self-interest, not exclusively, but at least in part. So, for example, if we want to solve global climate change, maybe carbon credits is the way to go. In the first place, we had to think about a global solution, but that solution could be one that appeals to market economic forces, and that would be okay. That actually might be the best. That might be the best mechanism.
I imagine a lot of people who are interested in these particular chapters in the book have practical reasons for being interested in it. It could be that they actually, work with groups. We're certainly all members of groups. What could you say about somebody who came into this and said, well, why would I think that this will actually be more effective than other group methods that are out there? There are certainly a number of organizational methods and methods for building leadership and healthy groups and so forth. Ostrom won the Nobel, but won the Nobel for analyzing descriptively the groups that were already functioning. And that's a little different set than somebody who might come to these chapters for guidance into how to do it effectively. Do you have thoughts about that? Are these design principles, as augmented perhaps by the psychological flexibility perspective, taking kind of things from the CBS point of view, are they a relatively coherent set? Do we have any reason to believe that they're any better a set than any of the many, many others that are out there in the almost cacophony of the behavioral science advice literature? Do you have views on that?
I might jump in there. Again, I'll probably use the language of a story, a narrative, and I'm thinking very, very functionally. How helpful are these principles? I'd say that we have pretty good evidence now that when we use these principles prescriptively, then it can be helpful for groups. But it by no means the final word. I mean, what strikes me about the principles when I look at them is that there are different levels of generality. For example, it seems to me that tracking agreed or monitoring agreed behaviours and graded sanctions is quite a specific prescription for how to do things, and the notion of equity or equitable distribution of costs and benefits is prescriptive, can be interpreted prescriptively, but it seems to happen at a much broader level of generality. Polycentric governance is arguably different to the others, or principle A, appropriate relations to other groups, is arguably different different to the others in the sense that all the others are about how the small group functions, whereas that Principle 8 builds the bridge to the next level up. I think that's incredibly helpful because it builds on the whole notion that we've been talking about of groups all the way down and the need to be able to flexibly move between different levels of organisation and understand selection by consequences at each level of organisation. So I think it's very, very helpful to have it in there. But it's sort of got a different quality to it. The one principle that I've wondered about sometimes, and I was struck when I first saw an articulation by David of the principles in our original handbook. He talked about supplementary principles. I can't remember what you called them, additional principles.
Auxiliary design.
Auxiliary principle. And the one that he put in as the example was learning. And it struck me that maybe that is a piece that often happens in modern day groups. You know, common pool resources and the context in which Ostrom was working, the resource might be relatively constant and the response to that resource might be relatively constant, but modern organisations and social networks and so forth are characterised by really rapid change. So you could argue that just as equity needs to be in there as a sort of overarching goal or value, in a sense, I would say that adaptability or evolution or learning in some sense, we could equally say that there needs to be some kind of principle there. But then, of course, you can say, well, that's exactly what monitoring and graded sanctions and conflict resolution is. All of that is learning in a way. What I'm trying to say is it's all words in the end. It's all a story. And the question becomes, how helpful is it? And I must say, in the groups that I've worked with, there's been an immediate resonance because, and if I may say, I think the reason there's a resonance is because there's sort of almost three ways of thinking that people come into, say, for example, a leadership class. So I taught the pro-social framework as my model of leadership in a public sector leadership course for a number of years. And I would have people in there who were psychologists, and they'd be all about the kind of how do we get people to cooperate and be touchy-feely and, you know, I don't want to be disparaging to psychologists, but they were all about the collaboration and the cooperation. And then you get people that are more political scientists and they're all about, you know, conflict and how do we manage self-interest and all that sort of thing. And then you get people that are from disciplines that are more systemic in their nature and they're all about how do we get groups to work together and scale this all up. The beauty of the pro-social framework, from my point of view, and what I found most attractive to, is this sort of three pieces of managing not just how do we bring people together, but how do we manage self-interest and how do we manage the group in context, the group in a broader system. So that's all a long way of saying I think the principles are coherent and I think they're functional, but I also think there's by no means the last word. Well, sorry, one last point, if I may. I think there's a great deal of convergence between the principles and the management and leadership literature. And from my point of view, that's, as David often says, that's an empirical test in a way. If there is convergence, that's a good thing, right? It means that other people working with these ideas have arrived at the same notions. It's just that pro-social, you know, what makes it distinctive perhaps is the particular packaging of these 8 principles and then packaging that with some degree of flexibility and perspective-taking ability. So it feels to me like it's got a lot of the bases covered.
Yeah, so let me give my answer to that question.
That was a long one.
It'll be overlapping largely with what Paul said, but I think I like to remind people what Ostrom found for common pool resource groups. So she found that they varied in their efficacy. There was a bell-shaped curve. Some performed beautifully, others were train wrecks, most were in the middle. And then those core design principles basically explain the variation. Now, when we generalize the core design principles, we expect to find the same thing for all kinds of groups. If I were to study business groups or churches or neighborhoods or whatever, I would expect to find a bell-shaped curve. Some would work beautifully. Nobody had to teach them. Others would be train wrecks. Most would be in the middle. And I would predict that it's those same core design principles that were quite explanatory. That also goes for business change methods or group change methods. They should be on a bell-shaped curve. Some will work great, others poorly, many in the middle, and I would expect the design principles to be explanatory. And I think that's what we find, basically. I mean, it would be odd if change methods didn't somehow converge on effective methods to some degree. So these are highly intuitive principles. So we're not saying that nothing else works. That's not the case. But I've actually been very, very impressed that people such as yourselves, Paul, you're very experienced at working with groups. So your colleague Robert Stiles is extremely experienced at working with groups. We have people like Frank Bond. We have people like Mark Van Vogt, who have studied the leadership and the management literatures extensively. And it is by no means the case that all of them have converged upon these principles. And actually, when you think of the two main pieces, the CBS piece and the core design principles piece, teaching those together, then I actually haven't found any other thing like it. We have newfangled methods like sociocracy and holacracy that have been quite convergent, and especially when it comes to decision making. But those are newfangled, and they're very minority methods. We have corporations such as Toyota that are famously successful, and yet they're not. Those practices aren't being practiced everywhere. So I've been quite impressed at the degree to which this package that we've assembled is actually adds a lot of value to most groups.
I'd like actually to put something out as an answer to the question that was asked and see what you think of it, which is, one of the major reasons to believe that these are relatively complete is the consilience with evolutionary theory. In the life sciences, the queen of the scientific theories, the one that I think is an unquestioned position, is evolution science itself, evolutionary theory itself. And if you cannot link what you're doing adequately to an evolutionary perspective, my guess is there's something wrong or incomplete with your perspective. Conversely, if you can do a pretty good job of that, my guess is you have a relatively coherent and relatively complete account. And what has happened here in this project is we have two evolutionarily focused perspectives. One of the behavioral sciences, one from the biological sciences, but then coming together in this focus on groups and finding that we can add things, even the things you wanted to add there, Paul, having to do with learning and so forth. That has to do with variation and selection, I think, fairly directly. And when we bring in psychological flexibility and perspective taking, we're building in some of, as was pointed out earlier, and David even asked a question about it, some of these things that make change more possible and people more receptive to it at the level of the group, since you have to account for multiple levels at the same time. And the psychological level is obviously part of, but not 100%. It isn't simply determined by that level. It's part of what happens at a larger level of organization. So I suspect we could do the same thing down and up. And, the Ostrom principles point to the up arrow. They haven't pointed to the down arrow. We brought that in by bringing in what we did from CBS. But even within CBS, you could probably go even farther with that. And, my guess is the groups whose members don't sleep well and exercise and eat well probably aren't going to do as well. I mean, you're all the way down to how well you're doing even as a biological organism in terms of how open you are, how adaptive, flexible, able to learn, work together and cooperate. So what do you think about that proposition that the definition of completeness is a kind of operational, kind of a thumb version of completeness would be being able to fit it into an evolutionary perspective?
Can I respond? So I think that for me at least, and my perspective is no doubt different to David's, I think you can easily fit it into an evolutionary perspective, but then there's probably a fair degree of latitude. There's probably a number of things you could have easily fitted into an evolutionary perspective. So at the level of, which principles should we have included, I'm sure we could reframe this and rephrase it and still fit it within an evolutionary perspective. But I guess I want to highlight the fact that what you're pointing to is the richness of the theory, the narrative that we have underneath this work, and that is crucially important. So David raised the example of holacracy, for example, or sociocracy. Those two approaches are very much focused on inclusive decision-making and how do we create inclusive decision-making, how do we organise groups non-hierarchically and so forth. Great stuff, a lot of overlap with what we do. But what I see in that work is a lower level of abstraction and much more prescriptive practices. So, you should have inclusive decision-making, should work with these X number of steps, and they include asking if anybody has objections or whatever. The problem is that works for some contexts and not for others. And unless you've got the sort of theorising that you're both talking about underpinning it, then we don't have the flexibility and adaptability to create alternate approaches. So I see what we're building as a set of abstract principles that are broad enough to be flexible in many, many contexts, whereas most of, and that actually is a problem too, right? Because it means that people have to do the work to apply it to their own particular context. They need to make it much more specific. And so a business leader weighing up what we do and holacracy might easily say, well, thank you, I'll have holacracy because they're telling me what to do in a much more specific way. But the problem is that may not work so well in community development or in software management or something like that. So
let me amplify that. So it's really important that you brought that up, Paul. So Ostrom made this point herself that although the core design principles are functional principles, and their implementation needs to be highly contextual. Back to a form of contextualism. Every group needs to monitor, but on the other hand, exactly how they monitor depends. Richly depends on the particular situation. Even groups that are more or less the same kind of group, like farmers associations in Nepal or something like that, ended up monitoring in different ways. And so this is what in evolutionary terms is called a many-to-one relationship between proximate and ultimate causation. For every functional arrangement, there are many possible implementations. It happens that way a lot in evolution, and it happens that way a lot in groups. And so one, I think, error that is made by change methods is to prescribe a particular implementation, is what we're saying. Which might work well for some groups and not others. So what we do is we make functional recommendations, and then it's up to the group to figure out. Now we can offer guidance in that also, but that would be a menu of possibilities. So this is where there's a symbiotic relationship, basically. We might say that decision making is really important, needs to be inclusive. Those are the functional recommendations. And now, how are you going to do it? Well, check out sociocracy, check out holacracy, check out something else, see if it works. But if it doesn't work, be prepared to abandon it for something that does a better job for you with the functional design principle in mind. And so that distinction between proximate and ultimate causation, absolutely foundational from an evolutionary perspective, but I have a ton of experience that tells me that that's not a distinction that's typically made. People are conflating those all the time. So here again, we have something which I think is quite special in the crowded field of change methods, is my experience.
Well, I wonder if that point doesn't fit in with the one that I just made, in the sense that, part of what's hard about a functional approach is that you do have to hold off on these more topographical, just do it this way kind of solutions. That's been true historically with functional approaches in the behavioral sciences, in the difficulties that they present in functional analysis, for example, or being open to many different ways to arrive at the same point. And I'd like to turn that into a slightly different direction as we come closer to the end of our hour together, which is, would you agree with me that evolution science has had a relatively hard time producing a robust applied science? You can look at applied areas and interpret them from an evolutionary perspective. And in certain areas, medicine and others, maybe you can point to some clear successes. But I'm not sure if it's because of the history of evolutionary perspectives or if it's due to my suspicion that has more to do with this, that it's hard to maintain the broad functional approach that you have to maintain to think about things in an evolutionary way on the one hand, and on the other hand, be a concrete change agent. That really is asking a lot of you. And that's true for clinicians who need to think about that way, but it's maybe true also for people who are trying to change groups. So I have two issues in here. The issue of why has it been hard to create a robust applied evolutionary science? And does it have something to do with the very strengths, which are also challenges, of a more radically functional and contextual perspective that evolutionary thinking leads you to?
Well, my answer to that would be a two-part answer. First, let's look at applications just within the biological sciences. And then you get into things like animal and plant breeding and things like that. And you find, I think, that there's been many successful applications within the biological sciences. Now, if you ask the same question within the human-related sciences, you get a completely different answer. But I think the reason for that is this terrible, complex history of evolutionary thinking in human affairs, something I've been, by the way, writing about and reviewing in other papers. But the bottom line is that it's not the case that it's been tried and failed. It's the case that evolutionary thinking was exorcised from the human behavioral sciences for the most part early on, and is only now is being given a fair shot. Actually, I'll take that back because, as you know, and as actually you taught me in many respects, behaviorism is an application of evolutionary thinking, and it's spectacularly successful. So I think that almost for the first time, we have this body of knowledge. Well, I should say that this body of knowledge, grown sophisticated in various ways, is now being applied for the first time. And I'm very optimistic, excited really at the successes in store for us, because I think it's only now basically getting its fair shot.
So I think we're starting to talk about multiple streams of evolution or dimensions of evolution, cultural evolution, and that's entering the popular press and popular parlance to a much greater extent than it had been previously. So evolution was previously, very much thought about in biological terms. That's one piece. The other piece that I think is really points to the second part of your comment, Steve, that we're not, our language encourages us to think in non-functional terms. Our language kind of bakes in entities that have certain characteristics and topographies and so forth. And I think what we're really fighting against with evolutionary thinking is that kind of ontological view of the world and we're more putting, it's not really so much about groups all the way down, it's about relationship and process all the way down. That's what a group is a relationship and a process. So we're really talking about process thinking, and that's very hard to do. I mean, even the fact that we talk about, say, groups all the way down, our group, we reify the group. It's not a group, it's a set of relationships, it's a process, and it can be reconstituted depending upon how you look at it. So built right into our very language is something that's antithetical to the point of view that we're trying to take, I think. And that's a pretty tough ask. And that's being pragmatism's problem, I guess, or the challenge of pragmatism, hasn't it?
Well, more and more, I've been speaking in terms of evolution and complexity. And complex systems theory as a theoretical framework, which needs to exist alongside of evolutionary theory, in some ways is more general than evolutionary theory because it applies to both living and non-living systems. So I think I'm affirming one of the things that you're saying, Paul, is that all human social systems, even very small groups, are actually very complex systems, and we need to keep that complexity in mind in addition to these evolutionary principles, especially when we're trying to change. When we're trying to change a complex system, then nobody's smart enough for that. There will always be unforeseen consequences, and so this forces a certain strategy of adaptive change, which is highly cautious, highly experimental, is likely to be highly contextual. So what works in one context is not going to work in another. And that's why randomized control trials are really not as wonderful as they're made out to be, because if you try to implement them in another situation where the background conditions are different, then all bets are off. So I think in that sense, change will always be complex because we're changing complex systems. It'll never be easy in that sense, but still the strategies that we develop can be very successful change strategies, and they will be nothing other than wisely managing evolutionary processes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, when we start talking about process thinking, it sort of sounds very mystical and hard to work with, but there are loads of processes like action learning and prototyping and so forth that take advantage of evolutionary thinking to work effectively with processes and to watch and observe and learn and change and so forth. And I completely agree with David's point. I mean, that randomized control trial is the very epitome, if you like, of a sort of mechanistic way of viewing things, as if the qualities of the thing are inherent in themselves rather than existent in the context. So there are, I guess my point is that there are ways that we can work with process that are effective, and it doesn't have to be.
Well, I just finished reading a piece on smart cities. I've been studying up on smart cities, and Boston is one of the good examples of a city that's becoming smart. What does that mean? It means developing all these metrics for things that work, dozens of them really, updating them daily even, and then having rapid feedback systems so that if something's not working, then you immediately can do something to try to get work better, and then the next day you have a new set of data in order to see if it's working. The choice of metrics is responsive to needs, and so what you're really beginning to see is something akin to what an organism has, basically. An organism has all these processes that are being regulated, all these sensors, feedback processes, and things like that. All these evolved by eons of evolution, and our task is to create organisms, superorganisms. And Boston is a good example of a city that's equipping itself with a nervous system. So it is possible. And once you get the idea, then I think you can just barrel forward with it. It's really like seizing the paradigm and understanding what you're trying to do and what needs to be done is half of the battle won, compared to some other paradigm, which is just sending you down the wrong road. And the more you try, the further off you get. So this is why I'm so very optimistic.
I wonder if this issue of process, I mean, maybe we can draw to a close here fairly soon, but and it relates to this issue of randomized trials and also what the ACT folks bring, the CBS folks bring to the, if you think of processes just as sequences of change, you can become overwhelmed by the number of processes that are involved in any one given situation. But if you think of the processes that fit within an evolutionary perspective, variations that can be selected and impact on selection and retention and other parts of the system, things that can actually be changed in some way, and shown that when they do, they impact in that way. So you go from a purely descriptive, almost overwhelming level of complexity to something much simpler. And so, for example, in the 200 randomized trials on ACT, there's about 70 mediational analyses that will tell you what are the functionally important pathways. And then there's another set of a dozen or so moderated mediation that will show for whom, what are the subgroups for whom those functionally important pathways apply. And then what that tells you is that when you target on these processes and change them, they are important. And what are the contexts in which that's so? That simplifies it. And so I do think as we move into a more evolutionary, multi-level, multi-dimensional kind of way of thinking about things, the kind of things we've done in our cooperation, there are some things inside the behavioral science traditions that actually could be quite useful to the evolution science.
I did not mean to imply otherwise. So,
no, and I know you didn't, but I just...
These are priceless, and they're priceless, and yet everyone who does them knows that they might not apply when the context changes. That doesn't lessen their value for what they've shown.
Yeah, but it is a message that to those who are kind of feeling a little overwhelmed at the scope and the levels, and it actually, evolutionary thinking has a way of simplifying the task, not making it more complex, even though it draws you into taking complexity seriously, because it gives you a small set of analytic tools with which to evaluate that complexity and to enter into it. All the more reason there should be a robust applied evolution science in the behavioral domain. And this project and this book is the attempt to sort of begin to do that by bringing the people together who are used to doing interventions at the behavioral level and the psychological level into contact with those who are used to thinking about processes in these kind of evolutionary principles way.
I think now that as we're talking, I'm thinking of some of the tragically wrong policy applications that we know are out there. So, for example, basically educational solutions that have been validated in some sense, they're evidence-based in some sense, but then they're rolled out in some cookie-cutter fashion, in which you're not allowed to adapt them to the context. Situations where people are being held accountable for change, in fact, but they're not given the authority for change. Metrics are provided for improvement, but it turns out that those metrics actually are not the right metrics. Economic metrics, chief among them. There seems to be so many ways that you can go wrong and that are going wrong. That I think a more sophisticated evolutionary approach would help solve some of those problems.
Perhaps I could give you a final topic, and then we'll let our conversation close. What do you think you've learned about the central topic of the book itself, of bringing a reconciliation between contextual behavioral science perspectives, not in a narrow way, just the CBS group, but I mean people who think in a functional contextual way, who are dealing with behavioral science issues, and evolutionists. Is there anything you want to reflect upon just of in the pro-social project itself, and on things you've learned or you take away from the years 2 or 3 we've worked on that?
Well, Paul, why don't you go, and then I'll go follow you.
Sure. Well, I've learned an awful lot from both of you. Probably the biggest thing, I think psychologists, at least mechanistic psychologists, the original training that I had, tend to be individualistic. We tend to focus on individuals, and I'd always been dissatisfied with that, and always had a leaning towards much more systemic, process-based perspectives. So for me, being able to communicate with you both has hugely enriched that view, the notions of multi-level selection and multi-sort of stream selection as well. I was thinking about this beforehand, is sort of there's also a couple of very specific things that I've really appreciated about working with David. One is his insistence on keeping fidelity to the Ostrom principles, partly because it was really good work, but also partly because it speaks to a very broad chunk of the population. And I think psychologists can very easily speak to only a small part of the population that are interested in words like empathy and emotional terms and so forth. One of the advantages, I think, of the way that we frame pro-social is that it can speak to the military or engineers or, groups that have no contact with some of these ideas. So I do appreciate that a great deal as a specific thing. But really the biggest thing is probably, the very topic of what we've been talking about, which excites the heck out of me, that we might be able to see ourselves in more process-oriented terms and in a way that's very much oriented around moving towards that which matters to us, that which really matters to us. How can we bring science into the discussion of alternate models of organising that really privilege human caring and relationships and spirituality and, all the things that matter so much beyond the dominant economic narrative. So thank you both.
Well, that's, thank you. My relationship with the CBS folks, including the two of you plus more, is really one of the most important things that's happened to me in my life. And I'll venture the prediction that the CBS side is going to take on the evolution a long time, way before the evolutionists are going to take on CBS. I think there's a number of barriers that my colleagues face. One is this ridiculous polarity that got set up between evolutionary psychology and the so-called standard social science model, so that even those evolutionists who are thinking about psychology, for example, don't see the Skinnerian tradition or anything that followed it as part of an evolutionary perspective. So that's something which needs to be overcome. It's going to take quite a lot of time. And then another barrier, which I've really makes me sad, is the whole concept of pragmatism and contextual behavioral science, that we can do science in real world contexts, and that we could actually alleviate suffering, improve the world in various ways, and remain the highest quality of basic science, is something which most of my colleagues don't get. And the idea of doing something that's like that, it's just way beyond their comfort zone. They want to stay in the ivory tower. They're scared to leave the ivory tower. So it is happening. I think that, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. And so that's why I always have a great time when I go to the ACBS meetings and so on. There's such excitement, there's such receptivity by people that already get the CBS part, and then they're seeing the evolutionary connections. That'll happen with my evolutionist colleagues, but not as fast.
Well, that's actually what I was pointed to, David, but I didn't mean to be offensive when I said it's been a hard go to get a really robust applied evolution science going over on the behavioral side. Just from the evolutionary side, it was exactly that thing that you just pointed to. And I think perhaps long run, that will be a much broader thing than anything CBS can imagine. But over the immediate future, the CBS crew, I think, has really shown a receptivity to those concepts and the willingness to get out there. And one of the things I've said to my CBS colleagues is that, this is very important for another reason that you may not be fully aware of, but it isn't by accident that the point at which the behavior analysts, the behavior modifiers, or so forth are stepping forward, that all of a sudden they're being slapped down with Clockwork Orange and the conflation of psychosurgery with trying to make a difference in culture and families and communities. And I think the same thing would happen on the evolution science side if people step forward. But the therapists and so forth are used to this, and they're used to trying to balance issues of values and who is the person that we're focusing on, who and being careful and working with children or others, not to simply allow one person to, say that person over there needs to change and so forth. Much of that's been worked out, not fully, but I mean, it's issues that we're very used to dealing with. And the evolution scientists are going to have to walk through that territory in order to really get into direct cultural change and so forth. So we have a kind of symbiotic need here, where the spillover, sometimes the very unfair things you've talked about of the, equating the idea that when people start thinking about evolution, people will die, on the one hand, just historically, with this, the same, that's spilling over to the behavioral community. But on the positive way, the things that have worked out since, maybe I think could be useful to the evolution science community. And so this is an interesting partnership that we've got going. You have thoughts on that? And
well, I should stem my pessimism, and this can be my final comment for this session. Is that our volume, I think, can have a big impact this way. And when we approached the evolutionists for this volume, we had a very high rate of acceptance. We picked the best and the brightest. We contacted them with our project, and most of them said, delighted. So there's a sense in which I think maybe I overstated the reluctance, and I would love to think that that our volume and these webinars that we're filming will be a giant step towards that unification. That was our goal.
Paul, any concluding thoughts on that?
Not really, Stan. I'm very glad to see it happening. I think it's an extremely productive collaboration.
But I'll share your sentiments. Actually, I do think the volume is sitting right on this issue. It's focused on it like a laser beam from both sides. And let's see, because I think the chapters themselves and the conversations reflect what might be possible going forward, and people will vote with their feet, and we shall see whether or not these ideas, which we've seen have a value in so many different ways, actually have value in bringing these two wings back together. And it really is a reconciliation. It's not new. They've been sort of working in the same territory with this selectivist perspective for a long, long time, but to actively live it out and see where it takes us is an exciting and new expression. So with that, maybe we can draw it to a close. And I want to thank my colleagues here for a great discussion. I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I hope people who watch this tape later on will as well.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tremendous.